I woke up with the sting of rope cutting into my wrists, a cold, damp smell wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. My breath came out in shaky bursts as my eyes adjusted to the faint light slipping through a thin window near the ceiling. Maine mornings in October were always cold, but this was a different kind of chill. It crept into my bones and settled there heavy and silent. I was in the basement. My basement. The stone walls of my father's old house stared back at me like they were holding their breath too. My wrists were tied behind the arms of an old chair. My ankles were bound to the legs so tightly that even the slightest movement burned. The air tasted like metal and wet wood. The water from a leaking pipe dripped in a slow, mocking rhythm that made time stretch endlessly. A small table sat against the far wall. On it, a white envelope waited like it had been placed there for me to see the second I opened my eyes. My throat was raw when I tried to speak. Nothing came out but a hoarse rasp. I forced myself to slide my chair a few inches closer, the legs scraping against the concrete floor. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting sharp and precise. This house belongs to the real Quinn now. Sign it, Ember, or stay down here. VK. My heart started pounding in my ears so loudly that for a moment I could not hear anything else. Then a voice crackled through a small speaker attached to the wall. The voice was smooth calm, too familiar. Veronica Kane, my stepmother. Good morning, Ember. I knew you would wake up eventually. I thought it would be poetic for you to wake up down there. That room meant something to your father. Now it means something to me. Her voice sliced through me. The last thing I remembered was sitting in the dining room upstairs the night before sipping a glass of wine at her invitation. She said she wanted peace, that we should talk about the inheritance like family. I remembered the chandelier lights above me blurring her eyes, shining with something cold. Then nothing. Just darkness. Now I was here. Bound. Underground. My own father's house had become my prison. The property he spent 3 decades building. The home where I learned to walk barefoot across creaky floors and touch the wood panels he carved himself. He left this house to me because he trusted me. Veronica wanted it. She always wanted it. But I never imagined she would go this far. My pulse pounded harder as I scanned the room. There was a camera above the door. Its red light blinked slowly steady like an eye that never blinked. I knew then she could see me. She was watching. My stomach tightened as I whispered to myself, "She's really doing this." My mind kept flashing back to her smile after the funeral. Calm, polished, controlled. She wore black like she was born to look elegant in someone else's grief. When the lawyer read the will and revealed that I would inherit the entire estate, including the $20 million in trust, she didn't flinch. She just tilted her head slightly like she was rearranging plans inside her head. The speaker crackled again. "You can make this easy, Ember. Just sign the papers. I will bring them down later. You do not have to suffer down there. You can walk away with something small. You know your father loved me. You don't need all of this." My jaw clenched so tight I thought it might break. She was already rewriting history. She was the outsider who arrived when my father was in his 60s, charming everyone with that gentle smile and soft voice. She made herself indispensable, slowly sliding into every decision he made. I let it happen because I thought I was protecting him from being lonely. But loneliness was nothing compared to this. The ropes cut deeper into my skin as I tried to move. I thought of the trust papers, the thick legal folders, the months of tension after his death. She knew the will. She knew there was no other way to get the estate. If I refused to sign, everything would stay with me. That was why she was doing this. My breath caught as a sound echoed above me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A door opened. Her heels clicked against the wooden steps. The camera light blinked faster. She came into view standing at the top of the basement stairs. She wore a silk robe like this was an ordinary morning, a cup of coffee in her hand. The image almost made me laugh if it did not make me sick. "You should have listened to me earlier," she said softly. "I gave you a chance to do this the easy way. She walked halfway down the stairs, her calmness more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. Then her eyes narrowed. "Your father always knew you were weak. You've only proved me right." She smiled a sharp little smile that made the chill in the basement feel colder. "This house is mine. He built it for me. You just don't want to accept it." My throat burned when I forced my voice out. "He built it for our family." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You have until tonight. If you don't sign, I will let the cold teach you what pride costs." Then she turned and walked back up the door, closing with a final click that sank into my chest. The sound of the lock sliding into place felt heavier than any chain. For a long moment, I just stared at the door. The woman who had shared my father's bed was now holding me like an enemy. I pressed my head back against the chair and tried to breathe. My pulse slowed into something sharp and focused. Fear still wrapped around me, but under it something else flickered. A small flame. Anger. I whispered into the silence. "You made a mistake, Veronica. I didn't know how yet, but this house wasn't hers, and neither was I." My wrists burned as I tried to move again. This was my father's house, my house, and I would not die here. What would you do if you woke up tied in your own basement? Drop your thoughts below. When I was a little girl, I used to run barefoot through the halls of this house, tracing the carved wood with my fingers and breathing in the scent of pine and salt air from the Maine coast. My father built this place with his own hands over 30 years, brick by brick, plank by plank, while growing the real estate company that bore our family name. Richard Quinn was not just my father. He was a force. People trusted him. His word carried weight in town meetings and business rooms. I remember him coming home covered in sawdust with that quiet smile, pouring himself black coffee at the kitchen counter and telling me that this house would always protect me. I believed him. Back then, I thought a house built on love and sweat could never become a battlefield. But I was wrong. He died on a cool August morning in 2025, a sudden stroke while he was on the porch overlooking the ocean. The phone rang and the world split in half. I remember the cold floor against my knees when I collapsed. At the funeral, the air felt too clean, too light, like it refused to carry the weight of him being gone. People came in black coats, offering hugs that slid off me like water off glass. Veronica stood beside me, elegant as always, wearing her pearls and a carefully measured expression of grief. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She just tilted her head and accepted condolences like she was collecting trophies. Veronica Kane had entered our lives when my father was 63. She walked into the house wearing a pale blue dress with smooth hair and a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was in my 20s then, carving out my career as an interior architect in Portland. She seemed refined, the kind of woman who never raised her voice and always said the right thing. She laughed at my father's jokes, remembered every name at the neighborhood gatherings, and placed her hands gently on his arm like she belonged there. My father adored her. He said she made him feel alive again. I wanted to believe him. After my mother passed when I was 17, he had carried loneliness like a shadow. So I stepped back, told myself to be happy for him. But there was something beneath that soft smile, something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. It started with small things. She began handling household bills, telling my father to rest. Then she started attending meetings with his lawyers, making notes on property valuations. She slowly placed herself in every corner of the financial life he had built. My father didn't see it as control. He saw it as devotion. He was aging, tired, happy to let someone take the wheel. I told myself she was just helping, but the way she looked at me, sometimes cold and assessing, told me she wasn't just helping, she was claiming ground. When he died, the lawyers called for the reading of the will. The conference room smelled of polished wood and paper, the kind of place my father used to negotiate deals that built empires. I sat there with my hands pressed together while the attorney unfolded the legal document. Veronica sat opposite me, composed and immaculate, not a single tremor in her hand. She already knew this moment was coming. The attorney cleared his throat and read the will in his steady voice. My father had left everything to me, the entire estate, the company shares, the house in Kennebunkport, $20 million in assets. Veronica's name was nowhere in the primary transfer. The silence that followed felt colder than any wind off the Atlantic. Veronica didn't gasp. She didn't frown. She just blinked slowly and gave a small smile that didn't look human. That was the moment I felt something shift between us, like a cord that had been stretched too tight finally snapping. Her elegance suddenly felt like armor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She just leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and stared at me in a way that made it clear this was far from over. In the weeks that followed, she became a presence that wrapped itself around every corner of the house. She was polite in public, cold in private. She started hinting at lawyers she could hire. She started talking about fairness, about everything she had done for my father, about what she deserved. I heard the steel in her voice, even when she smiled. She wasn't grieving, she was calculating. I kept working at my small design studio in Portland, thinking distance would give me space to breathe. But every time I drove back to the house, I felt the temperature drop. I saw how she moved through the rooms like she already owned them. I saw how the staff people who had known my father for years started hesitating around me, as if they had already been reminded who might sign their checks in the future. One afternoon, I found a letter on the kitchen counter written in smooth ink. She had drafted a proposal to co-manage the estate. The language was polite, but the meaning was clear. She wanted control. I crumpled it and threw it in the trash. A week later, I started receiving anonymous messages. "You should sign. It'll be easier." She was careful. There was no proof it was her. But I knew. I tried to hold on to the hope that reason would work, that we could just coexist in the shadow of my father's legacy. But she had already decided what she wanted, and it wasn't peace. It was power. In late September, the letter from my father's lawyer arrived at my apartment. The official date for signing the inheritance documents had been set, October 3rd. That was the day I would take full legal control of everything. It should have felt like security, but instead it felt like a storm rolling in from the ocean. Veronica's smile had been sharper these past few weeks, her voice lower, her gaze heavier. I remember holding that letter in my hands, the paper crisp and warm from the afternoon sun coming through the window. My heartbeat was steady but cold. I had spent years designing other people's homes, crafting beauty and comfort out of bare walls. Now I was about to inherit the house that built me. But somewhere deep in my chest, a whisper told me she would not let it happen quietly. I folded the letter and set it down. The last of the evening light slid across the floor like a warning. I told myself I was ready. I wasn't. The first time I truly saw Veronica without her mask was the afternoon the final legal documents were confirmed. It was supposed to be a simple meeting with the family attorney, a routine step before the signing. The law was clear. My father's estate passed entirely to me. Veronica was entitled to nothing beyond a modest stipend he'd outlined for her. But when she sat across from me in that polished room with its quiet hum of fluorescent lights, something in her shifted. She no longer wore the polite widow's expression, no longer tilted her head with soft grace. Her smile had a blade hidden inside it. She listened to the attorney outline the terms, every word like a door closing in her face, and she never interrupted. She didn't need to. Her silence alone was loud enough. From that day on, the tension began to coil tighter. Family lawyers who had once been distant professionals suddenly became messengers. They called with half-formed suggestions about splitting assets to avoid lengthy conflict. They framed it as if they were protecting me, but I knew better. Veronica had money of her own, but not like this. $20 million, and the house meant power, and she wasn't built to walk away quietly. She started showing up at the attorney's office uninvited, trailing that cold perfume of hers, smiling like she was the one being wronged. I refused every compromise. My father's will was not a discussion. He had chosen. But with each refusal, the air in the house grew heavier. At night, when I returned from work, I sometimes found the back door unlocked, though I was sure I had turned the bolt before leaving. Small things went missing. A framed photo of me and my father from the porch vanished from the hallway wall one day. 2 days later, it reappeared in the kitchen. Veronica didn't say a word about it. She didn't have to. It was a quiet war. The messages began not long after that. Short, precise, always the same number. It'll be easier if you just sign. No threats. No names. Just a sentence that felt like a hand pressing against my throat. The first time I received it, I stared at the screen for 5 full minutes, my pulse tight and steady. By the third message, I started saving screenshots. I even took them to the attorney, but without proof of origin, they were useless. He told me to stay calm. I tried, but calm doesn't last when someone circles your life like a wolf that knows your walls are soft. She started appearing in places she had no reason to be. At my favorite coffee shop in Portland, standing in line behind me. At the grocery store, pretending it was coincidence. One night, I pulled into the driveway and saw her sitting on the porch in my father's old rocking chair, the one he used every evening at sunset. She didn't move when I got out of the car. She just rocked slowly, eyes fixed on the ocean. "This house was always more mine than yours," she said softly when I passed her. He knew how much I loved it. Her voice was calm, but the meaning was carved in stone. I didn't answer. I couldn't. A week before the signing date, she called me. Her tone was warm, almost gentle. "Ember, why don't you come to dinner tomorrow night? We should talk like family. No lawyers, no signatures. Just us." Every part of me screamed that it was a trap, but there was also a part that still remembered the promise I made to my father after he married her. I told him I would try, so I said yes. The night of the dinner, the house glowed in soft golden light. She wore a cream silk dress and had set the table with crystal glasses and china. There were flowers on the table like she was staging a perfect memory. "You look tired," she said as I walked in, that half smile painted carefully on her lips. "I just want us to find peace." It's what he would have wanted. She poured the wine herself, rich red, swirling in my glass like something breathing. I didn't drink at first. She spoke about my father, about the years they shared, about how hard it was to be left behind. Her voice cracked at the right moments like someone who had practiced every note. Then her words began to twist. "You've always been so stubborn, Ember. Always convinced everything has to be yours. But you forget who kept this house alive when your father started to fade, who made sure everything ran, who stood beside him when you were off chasing your career." Her smile was sharp now. "I'm not asking for everything, just what's fair." I set the glass down. "Fair isn't stealing," I said quietly. She didn't blink. "I've given you every chance to do the right thing," she whispered. "You won't like what happens if you keep pretending this is yours." The chandelier light above us flickered for a second like it knew what was coming. I forced a smile. "You can't scare me, Veronica." Her eyes narrowed just enough for me to see what she'd been hiding all this time. The softness was a costume. Underneath was steel. She leaned back in her chair, lifted her own glass, and drank slowly like a queen, watching her plans unfold. "I don't have to scare you," she said. "I just have to make you understand." She poured more wine into my glass, her hand steady. Against my better judgment, I took a sip. It tasted like dark fruit and slow decay. I told myself to stop after that one, but the room began to soften around the edges faster than I expected. Her voice started to stretch, pulling long like a ribbon in water. I blinked hard, trying to steady my focus, but the chandelier above me blurred. Her face floated in the golden light, her smile a perfect curve of control. I remember gripping the edge of the table, my pulse hammering, a heavy weight pulling me under. She stood, slowly, walked around the table and whispered something I can still hear even now. "This house will be mine, one way or another." The sound of the glass tipping over as my fingers went slack was the last thing I heard before the world tilted sideways. The chandelier lights smeared into streaks of gold and black, her perfume wrapped around me like smoke. Then everything went dark. The first sound I heard was the dripping of water, slow, precise, like a clock counting seconds I could no longer see. My throat felt like sandpaper. My wrists burned, and when I opened my eyes, the ceiling above me wasn't the warm wood of my bedroom. It was rough stone. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of mildew and rust. It took me a few seconds to remember where I was. Then it all crashed in at once. The dinner, the wine, the blurred chandelier. her face leaning over mine like a shadow wearing perfume. I jerked against the ropes and pain sliced across my wrists. I was tied to the same chair I had seen down here 100 times before when I was a child exploring the basement with a flashlight. Only this time the lock on the door wasn't a game. Somewhere above, I heard the faint creak of floorboards. Then, the static of a small speaker mounted high on the wall crackled to life. Her voice filled the room smooth and sharp. "Sign over the house and trust Ember, or rot down there." No shouting, no threat in the traditional sense. Just the cold certainty of someone who believed she had already won. I stared up at the speaker, my pulse hammering. "Veronica," I rasped, my voice cracking. "You won't get away with this." A soft laugh bled through the static. "You think anyone will come looking for you?" "You've always been so independent, Ember. You take off for days. I told everyone you went on a retreat. People believe what I tell them. You know that." The speaker clicked off. I forced myself to scan the room. It wasn't the same basement I had played in years ago. She had changed it, reinforced it. A steel lock on the door. A new security camera tucked high in the corner, its red light blinking steadily like an unblinking eye. A microphone embedded near the speaker. She could hear everything I said. Watch everything I did. I pulled against the ropes again. The chair scraped the stone floor with a sound that shot through my skull like a blade. No give. My wrists were already raw. My ankles felt like they were swelling. The air down here was cold and damp. Not the kind of chill you can brush off. The kind that crawls inside your skin and settles there. The first hour I screamed. I screamed until my throat tore itself into a rasp. I kicked the chair, slammed my heels against the floor, begged for anyone to hear me, but the house was too big, too isolated, the walls too thick. Veronica knew that. She knew no one would hear. The second hour, I tried to count the bricks in the wall across from me, anything to keep from unraveling. I had designed part of this basement years ago when my father turned it into a wine cellar. I recognized the way the stones curved near the back corner. I could almost hear his voice as he talked about airflow and temperature control. The memory hurt like a blade twisting inside me. The third hour was worse. I started to imagine footsteps that weren't there, shadows that weren't moving. Every sound seemed louder down here, every drip of water another reminder of how alone I was. At some point, the door creaked open. A beam of light cut across the floor. I held my breath, heart hammering, but no one came down. Instead, something slid across the concrete toward me. A small tray with a plastic bottle of water and a protein bar. She didn't say a word. She just shut the door. The lock clicked. It wasn't kindness. It was control. She wanted me alive. She needed my signature. I managed to work the bottle cap open with my teeth and drank slowly, forcing myself not to gulp it down. The first sip burned its way down my throat like fire. I hated how grateful my body felt for her crumbs. The next day, or what I thought was the next day, because down there time blurred like fog, she returned to the speaker. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But this won't end well for you. You know the law, Ember. It doesn't protect you from yourself. All you have to do is sign. I'll give you a piece of the estate, a house somewhere warm. You like warm places, don't you? You don't have to suffer." I stared at the camera and whispered, "You'll burn for this." Her laugh came through low and clear. "I already have the world believing what I want. You're just a problem that needs time to solve." 3 days passed like a fever dream. I tried screaming the first day. On the second day, I stopped wasting my breath. The third day was quieter in a way that forced me to listen. My head throbbed from dehydration. My wrists were bruised raw, but the longer I sat there, the clearer my mind became. Panic burned fast and loud, but it didn't last forever. When it ran out, what remained was something harder. I started to watch. Every time the door opened a crack, I noted the sound of the hinges, the way the light fell at a certain angle in the afternoon. I counted the seconds between her steps upstairs and the moment the speaker came on. I traced the pattern of water dripping from the pipe near the wall. It wasn't just noise. It told me where the weakest part of the room was. The pipe was old, maybe older than I realized. It fed into the north side of the basement. My father had mentioned sealing it years ago, but never did. I remembered something else, an access hatch near the far corner hidden behind the old shelving unit that had once stored bottles of wine. It connected to an unused crawl space that led toward the foundation. As a child, I'd climbed inside that space once before. My father yelled and pulled me out. That hatch might still be there. I tested the ropes around my wrists. They didn't loosen much, but every time I shifted, they gave a fraction of an inch. I knew I couldn't brute force my way out, not with Veronica watching. I had to be smarter. She thought she'd broken me by throwing me in the dark, but darkness wasn't new to me. After my mother died, I spent years learning to hold my breath in it. Outside, I heard the distant rumble of a car. Her hired security. She had thought of everything, but she underestimated the one thing that mattered most: me. The third night, I sat in silence, staring at the blinking red camera light. My throat was dry, my hands numb, but the fear that had held me like a fist had loosened its grip. I didn't know how yet, but I would get out. I would not give her this house. Not the house my father built, not the trust she believed she owned. I leaned forward as far as the ropes allowed and whispered to the camera, letting her watch my mouth move. "You made a mistake, Veronica. You should have left me in the dark without hope. But you left me in my own house, and I know every inch of it better than you ever will." I closed my eyes and rebuilt the basement in my head the way I had drawn it in 2019 when my father asked me to redesign the lower level into a wine room and storage corridor. I could see the measurements like chalk lines on the inside of my eyelids: 30 feet from the stairwell to the back wall, 10 feet from the shelving to the old foundation. A narrow gap where the original stone met the newer brick. We had left an access path there because the contractor warned us that the ventilation might need service. That was the path I needed now. I pictured the map of ductwork I had approved. The new climate system ran along the east wall, but the house still kept one older vent line tied to an abandoned air shaft that once carried sea air into the cellar. My father had joked that the house breathed through that rib. It was sealed far up the shaft, but the lower elbow still existed behind the shelving. If I could reach it, I could push a message into the line and send sound where it was not meant to go. I forced my breath to slow and listened for the pattern of her movements above me. Morning footsteps toward the kitchen, midday silence. Late afternoon on the porch, night whispers over the speaker. I had to act between those rhythms. The ropes around my wrists were rough, but they were not new. Whoever tied me had pulled tight and double-knotted, then looped the end around the chair arm. That gave me an anchor point I could work against. I began to twist my right wrist in a slow circle, then reverse, then press the bone against the chair edge to grind a gap between skin and fiber. Pain flared like a coal being fed air. I welcomed it. Pain meant space, and space meant strategy. Every few minutes I went still and counted. I needed to know if the camera tracked movement or simply recorded. The red light never quickened. Good. The microphone would hear me if I groaned, so I swallowed every sound and moved only when the water drip masked the scrape of rope on wood. I studied the floor. A smear of dust near the shelving indicated recent contact. Either she or a hired hand had shifted the shelves to run wiring. They had not locked the unit into the wall studs. Good again. I could tip it with leverage if my legs were free. My ankles were tied to the chair legs, but the knot sat against the inner curve of my left ankle. I could hook the edge of the knot on the chair rung and rub until the cord loosened. It would take time and it would hurt, but time and hurt were the only currencies I had left. When the speaker clicked on near noon and her voice floated down with that silk calm, I let my head loll forward and answered in a weak whisper to keep her convinced. She wanted me docile. Let her have the picture. After the click-off, I returned to the knot and worked in small, relentless motions. I lost track of minutes. Thin threads began to give under the friction. I bent my ankle, pressed harder, bent again, worked heat into the fiber until a single loop slackened. I slid 2 toes through and pulled. The pressure on my left ankle eased a fraction. I froze and waited. No door, no voice. I breathed again. I kept going until my left foot slipped free. Relief crashed into me so hard I nearly sobbed. I did not. I braced the freed foot against the floor and used it to inch the chair closer to the shelving unit heel by heel, scrape by scrape, tracking the camera with the corner of my eye so my movement looked like restless discomfort rather than intent. When the front leg of the chair grazed the base of the shelving, I paused and counted to 60. I pressed my free foot against the lower shelf and pushed. The unit shivered but held. I pushed again longer and felt one of the rear feet lift a hair. The metal frame was heavier than I remembered. My calves trembled. I pushed one more time, and the shelf groaned a tired sound that matched the old pipe drip. It shifted an inch. I whispered a thank you to the house under my breath. With the gap open, I stretched my foot into the dark seam and groped for the vent elbow. My toes touched cold metal. I pressed along its curve until I found a small slot where the cap met the joint. I needed a message to travel up that hollow. Something short and unmistakable. I twisted my body and dragged the chair back to the small table where the envelope had been. The envelope itself lay under the chair leg where I had knocked it earlier. I worked it up with my toes and guided it toward my fingers. My wrists were still tied, but I could pinch the paper between two fingers and tear a narrow strip with my teeth. On the strip, I wrote with slow care using the edge of a splinter I had loosened from the chair. The letters were crooked and faint, but legible. Help. Basement. Quinn house. Locked. I folded the strip and inch by inch maneuvered it to my toes again. I slid it into the vent slot and pushed until it caught. Sound would carry there. If a maintenance worker or a neighbor ever passed the exterior grate, a loose paper might flutter. It was a thin hope, but it was a new line to the world. Now I needed proof that would not blow away on the wind. When the door finally opened later that day and light cut across the floor, I sagged in the chair and let my head roll to one side, as if the effort of lifting it might be too much. Veronica stepped onto the top stair and paused. I kept my eyelids half closed and my breaths shallow. She came down 2 steps and studied me the way a collector studies a rare object. I could smell her perfume, cool and powdery, a scent that always made me think of glass cases and velvet ropes. She set a bottle of water on the 3rd stair and then crouched as if to examine the knot of my wrists from a distance. Satisfied, she stood and slipped a hand into the pocket of her silk robe. When she shifted, the robe gaped a fraction, and I saw the outline of a small phone on the inside pocket, the older backup model my father kept for emergencies. Veronica had always hated it because it was not stylish. She had probably kept it as a spare without thinking it held access to numbers he once trusted. She took a step closer, leaned near my ear, and whispered that I could end this by being sensible. Her voice was sugar around a cold stone. When she rose, the robe brushed my arm. That single touch was the window I needed. I turned my wrist inside the loop so the rope hid my hand from the camera and let my fingers slide into the robe pocket and close on the phone. I did it slowly enough that the fabric did not tug. For a second, the weight of the device felt like a live animal. She straightened and walked up the stairs. I kept my hand still until the door clicked shut. Only then did I let the phone settle against my palm and then down to the seat between my thigh and the chair arm. I sat without moving for a full minute while my pulse slowed. Then I turned the device face down and pressed the side button with the tip of my little finger. The screen lit faintly. A lock code challenge glowed. My stomach flipped. I tried my father's birth month and day. It failed. I tried the day my mother died. Failed. I whispered the date of the company founding and entered it. The screen opened. Thank you, Dad. The signal bars were weak in the basement, a single whisper of connection. That was enough for one short action. I opened the voice recorder. I leaned close and kept my voice steady and low. She is keeping me here. She wants the house. Veronica Kane did this. I saved the file with a name my father would have used, House File 1. I needed to move it somewhere she could not erase if she found the phone. My father and his lawyer had set up an emergency address after he got sick. It forwarded anything unusual to a secure archive whenever a login happened from a new device. I tapped the mail icon. The app asked for credentials, and the device suggested one of my father's old autofill entries. I typed what I remembered of the master passphrase he used when he taught me to manage studio contracts. Part of it was a line from a poem. Part of it was the name of this town. The screen cleared to an inbox with a string of legal memoranda. I attached the audio file and wrote a plain subject line. Evidence. I sent it to the emergency address and to myself. A warning flashed about low signal. I moved the phone closer to the floor vent and raised it until the bar flickered, then pressed send again. The message queued then showed a sent stamp. Auto forward would copy it if anyone else tried to open the account. I powered the phone down and slid it back into the robe pocket of the chair arm where her shadow would fall when she came near, not where a guard would glance. I tightened my left ankle back into the loosened rope to keep the picture of compliance neat. Then I let my head fall forward and breathed in slow counts. I had a line out. I had proof leaving the house. I had a plan for the hatch. All I needed now was patience, and patience was something grief had already taught me in long winter nights by this very ocean. When the speaker clicked on at dusk and her voice floated down again, soft and certain, I looked at the camera with eyes that played at resignation, while my mind measured angles and minutes. You think I am weak, I thought. You think ropes and walls make you strong. But I drew these lines. I know where they end. I crawled through the crawl space on hands and knees until my palms were raw and my shoulders burned, following the map of the house that lived in my head, like a secret recipe. The access hatch groaned when I pushed it, and the crawl space smelled of old mortar and the salt air that seeped through the foundation, but it led me inch by inch toward fresh air and the grease-streaked grate at the back of the property that opened to a service alley. The ropes had cut into my skin so deep they had left angry ridges, and my hair clung wet to my scalp where sweat and the cold had met. I remember the first breath of outside air like prayer. I remember how the sky looked washed and small over the roof as I pulled myself up and staggered into the bracken behind the garage. The house rose behind me like a thing that had turned on its maker. I wrapped my fingers around the robe fabric and the old phone until everything blurred into one movement. Move, hide, go. I did not run. I needed a plan that would not crumble if I tripped. I limped to the car and drove with one hand on the wheel, the other pressed to the wounds on my wrist because adrenaline kept my foot steady and the radio drowned out the pounding in my head. Portland felt farther than it should have, each mile a tiny thread leading away from the basement where Veronica had thought she could bury me. I walked into Harold Price's office like someone walking into an old cathedral because for me, Harold was as much a fixture of my father's world as the carved mantel and the ledger books in the attic. He stood when he saw me, and I did not have to say anything for him to understand that the commission of my face was not a winter headache or a bad dream. He had been my father's counsel for decades. His hands were steady, his eyes a particular gray that missed nothing. I walked to his chair and sat without formally asking. I pulled my sleeve up and showed him the rope marks. He reached out and did not touch, only nodded, understanding the language of injury without a word. Then I handed him the phone. Harold listened to the recording in his office with the stoic patience he used for difficult closings and elegies. When Veronica's velvet voice came through the room, felt smaller like a packed courtroom waiting for an opening. My voice on the tape was thin and scared and measured, but it said exactly what I needed it to say. She is keeping me here. She wants the house. Veronica Kane did this. Harold did not look surprised. He had seen the way family money could loosen the seams of decency in reasonable people, and he knew the law's blunt tools for when people bent them into cruelty. He stood, walked to the window, and watched the river that cut through the city and told me to sit. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick file with my father's name on it and laid it open like a map of intent. There's a clause, he said quietly, as though the word itself might be a relief. Your father was thorough. He knew the kind of things money can encourage. He explained it to me, an emergency provision embedded in the estate plan that allowed him as trustee to freeze transfers when credible evidence suggested coercion or undue influence. It was designed for moments when his name might be used as a weapon. When I told him what had happened in the basement, the way Veronica had spoken through the speaker, the water drip and the camera, Harold leaned forward, set his hands flat on the desk, and said he would act. But he did not move rashly. He asked for chain of custody and corroboration. He taught me then and there a lesson more useful than any planning meeting I had sat through in my career. Evidence mattered more than outrage. The tape would be enough to alarm him, but not enough to take to the court and win by itself. Cameras needed to be lifted, metadata preserved, witness statements collected. He called a deputy he trusted and instructed a secure route to retrieve the camera files from the house without tipping off Veronica. He told me to go home with him to rest while he organized a team to secure the property and to file motions to freeze assets. I watched him work methodically, telephone calls, page-turning legal citations, and a strange calm descended, the kind that arrives when someone with practiced hands takes your fear and sorts it into labeled boxes. Back at the house, Harold moved with the authority of someone who had spent a life in rooms where money and grief mixed. He coordinated with a private investigator who specialized in digital forensics and with a county sheriff who owed him favors. We all knew Veronica's name. We all had seen her move through town with that composed smile. But the law was a different thing. It required proof, not impressions. The forensic techs treated the camera like evidence at a crime scene, gloves and sterile bags logging serial numbers and times. They removed the device from the high corner where its red light had watched me, and they photographed the wiring, the angle of view, the pattern of dust that proved its placement had been recent. They extracted the raw files and held them on encrypted drives. I watched the technician scrub through the footage and felt my stomach drop, and then rise when he found the clip. Veronica moving down the stairs. The glint of her robe pocket where she had hidden my father's old phone. The angle of her hands adjusting the speaker, and then the sound of my voice in the dark. The metadata stamped each file with a time and an unedited collar of truth. Harold explained how this would be presented: first the emergency petition to a probate judge, then an order to freeze any transfers from the trust pending a hearing. He marked up the legal language with a careful pencil, underlining phrases that made the clause operative: undue influence, coercion, credible threat. He would file the petition that afternoon, but more was needed. I needed independent corroboration of the messages I had received, the anonymous pressures, and the missing items in the home that suddenly meant more than sentimental value. We collected everything. I had saved screenshots of the messages, the torn strip from the vent that I had pushed into the shaft, the small file on the phone that had automatically forwarded to the emergency address established in my father's estate plan. Harold's eyes softened when he saw the way my hands shook as I handed him the email with the timestamp showing the forwarded audio. The auto-forward was key. It proved a chain that could not be easily refuted. "You did a smart thing," he said. "Your father thought of these possibilities." The forensics team also dug into the phone's records and found that the device had been used recently and that the recordings had been created and transferred within hours of my escape. That kind of timestamp would make the difference between a messy family battle and a court-ordered freeze. As the day dragged on, Harold filed the emergency petition with the probate court in York County. The clerk took the packet, stamped it, and we were told to expect a short hearing. In the meantime, Harold arranged for a temporary restraining order, not only to block transfers, but to designate the property as subject to supervised custody so that Veronica could not alter the scene or the evidence. He also called in a protective order on my behalf. I sat in the waiting room of his office, the sun angled over the harbor and slashing like a cut through the city, and felt both hollow and steady. The attorney's office became a small command center. He signed affidavits and fed the forensics output into his printer. He called an investigator to corroborate my story about the ladder, the messages, the staged dinner. By dusk, we had a skeleton of a case. The recording I had made, the camera footage, the forensic logs, a witness statement from the investigator who would later speak to the demeanor of the housekeeper who had been asked by Veronica to tidy the cellar on the day I disappeared. Harold spoke to me rarely, but when he did, it was in a voice that left no room for theatrics. "We move now," he said. "We do not let rumors decide outcome. Evidence will." The petition asked for an immediate temporary freeze on the trust's disbursement and the appointment of an independent trustee pending the hearing. It also sought judicial oversight of anyone seeking to alter the house or remove assets. The judge reviewed the emergency materials that evening and issued a provisional order to freeze funds and to enforce an evidence preservation hold on the property. Veronica would be notified, but not before the team secured the house and backed up all the media. It felt surreal to watch the legal gears turn with such speed. I had expected resistance obfuscation, months of polite footwork. Instead, the document that had been my father's safeguard snapped into action the moment I presented the tape and the camera evidence into Harold's hands. He had always told me that documents were not just paper, but promises, and tonight, that promise was keeping me from being erased. When the sheriff and the forensics van left the house, They carried with them drives that were double-locked and logged in a chain of custody record. I watched them go, feeling like a small, exhausted woman who had somehow learned how to hold a rifle simply by watching someone else aim. Harold stayed long enough to tell me the next steps a hearing in front of the probate judge within days, the temporary appointment of an independent trustee and a criminal referral if the evidence warranted it. He also advised me to be quiet publicly and to let the legal team handle statements. The smell of disinfectant from the forensics van lingered in the hallway as I sat on the office couch and tried to process everything. The thing that surprised me most was not the relief of the order, but the quiet rightness of the law moving like that when the facts were set down. It gave me a kind of power that was not about force, but about holding proof and letting the system do its work. Later that night, I replayed the recording on my own phone in a hotel room and listened to my voice again, raw and small. Veronica's tone on the other end was silky and wicked and ordinary at once. Hearing it made my jaw tighten. I thought of the basement and the way the camera had watched me. I thought of my father and the way he had planned for the worst. My hands hovered over the CTA I had considered before speaking to Harold, and I added it here because this is not only my story. Would you fight back if your own family locked you up for money? Comment below. The day of the hearing smelled like salt water and cold marble. November air pressed against the old courthouse in York County, Maine, with a chill that bit the lungs and settled on the stone steps like a warning. I walked into that building with my coat collar turned up my wrists, still marked with bruises that no makeup could fully hide. My hair was tied back, but loose strands framed my face because I refused to erase what she had done to me. Across the hallway, I saw Veronica Kane step out of a black car with her attorney at her elbow. She wore pearl earrings, a camel wool coat, and a smile so polished it almost glowed under the gray sky. She didn't look like a woman who had locked someone in a basement for 5 days. She looked like a widow attending a luncheon poised and untouchable. For a second, our eyes met. She tilted her chin just slightly the way she always did when she believed she had the upper hand. I held her gaze. I didn't blink. The courtroom smelled of varnished wood and history. Rows of benches filled with a mix of family acquaintances, curious townspeople, and reporters who had caught wind of the inheritance freeze. Cameras were not allowed inside, but whispers filled the air like dry leaves. Harold Price, my father's attorney, sat beside me at the petitioner's table. His glasses caught the morning light, and his hands rested on the thick binder of evidence we had assembled every file, every recording, every still image of Veronica in that basement. Across the aisle, Veronica sat upright. Her attorney, a man named Blake Harrow, stood already in posture for battle. Blake was tall, silver-haired, with a voice built for cross-examination. He had handled enough high society disputes to sound both indignant and reasonable at once. He was counting on the room seeing her as a widow, not a captor. The judge entered, robes trailing, and the chatter dissolved into silence. He was a seasoned man, the kind whose eyes carried 30 years of probate hearings and family wars dressed up as legal disputes. His voice was calm when he opened proceedings, but the room felt tighter with every word. He called the case number, outlined the emergency freeze order, and invited opening statements. Blake buttoned his jacket and began to weave a story that painted me as unstable, grief-stricken, and prone to dramatics. He called the basement story an emotional reaction to losing my father, claimed that the evidence had been manipulated, that I had a history of exaggerating familial tension. His tone was smooth. His phrases were practiced. He made sure to say my name softly, like someone humoring a fragile thing. I listened without interrupting. I let him paint his little portrait because I knew what was coming next. When Harold rose to speak, he did not pace or gesticulate. He opened the binder and laid a single photograph on the evidence screen, my wrists, the bruising still vivid, taken by a forensic nurse. He spoke simply. "These are not theatrics." Then he played a short clip from the camera retrieved from my basement. Veronica descending the stairs, the soft sweep of her robe, the glint of her hand on the steel latch. No narration. No commentary. Just the image. A murmur rolled through the room like a wave against stone. Blake tried to object, claiming chain of custody, but Harold had documented everything. The judge allowed the footage. Veronica kept her posture, but I saw the first flicker in her jawline, the tiny tightening of someone who suddenly recognizes that her mask has edges. When it was my turn to speak, I stood. My knees didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. I told the court what it smelled like in that basement, how the rope dug into my skin, how her voice floated through the speaker with that calm certainty. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. Truth told cleanly is sharper than any weapon. Blake tried to cross-examine, asking whether I could be mistaken, whether I had been under stress. I met his questions with silence first, then with calm, deliberate answers that did not flinch. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Harold handed me the phone I had kept hidden all those days encased in an evidence bag. The judge nodded. I pressed play. The speaker in the courtroom filled with the sound of my own trembling breath, followed by Veronica's velvet-coated command. "Sign over the house and trust Ember. Or rot down there." The room went dead still. Not quiet. Still. The kind of still that happens when everyone in a room understands they are listening to something they cannot unhear. Veronica didn't move at first. She sat perfectly straight, chin-lifted eyes locked on the table. Then, a single beat later, she blinked once, slow, deliberate. Blake began to object again, but the judge silenced him with a hand. The recording played to the end. My breath, the rope creaking the way she cut the speaker. The people in the gallery shifted like a single body. I saw two of my father's old business partners in the second row lean toward each other, whispering. A reporter from the Kennebunkport Gazette scribbled faster. The bailiff adjusted his stance. Harold didn't need to say anything. The sound spoke for itself. Blake tried to recover, spinning a story about edited audio and personal vendettas, about grief-twisting memory, about how anyone could fabricate a moment in the age of technology. But then Harold cued the next piece, the raw camera footage. The grainy video showed Veronica entering the basement with cuffs and rope in her hands. It showed her placing the tray of water. It showed her pausing to listen to the silence. The timestamp on the footage matched the metadata from the recording on the phone. It was irrefutable. I didn't look at the screen while it played. I looked at her. Her spine stiffened. Her eyes darted toward her lawyer, then toward the judge. When the footage ended, the room exhaled all at once. Veronica stood finally, and when she did, the world tilted a little. She tried to speak, to build a bridge back to the control she'd always had. "That is not what it looks like," she said, her voice sharp around the edges, the pearls at her throat gleaming under the lights. But her lawyer's hand on her arm told everyone what mattered. He knew they were losing control of the narrative. She tried again, louder this time. "She's twisting everything. This is a family matter. She hated me from the start." But the sound of her own voice after that recording only made the silence around her heavier. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Kane, you will speak through your counsel." She froze, mouth half open. Blake swallowed and asked for a recess. The judge denied it. The prosecution of the inheritance claim wasn't a criminal trial yet, but the evidence we presented triggered an immediate legal shift. Harold handed over the emergency clause from my father's will, highlighting the section about coercion. The judge read it aloud. "In any case, where credible evidence of undue influence or coercion is presented, the assets of the trust shall be frozen pending criminal investigation." Blake tried to argue. Veronica tried to smile again, but this time her face couldn't hold it. Her fingers clenched the table. Her lawyer lowered his voice and leaned into her ear, but she shook her head, the gesture jagged, almost frantic. The judge asked her if she understood the gravity of the allegations. She nodded, but her eyes had gone glassy. The bailiff stepped forward when the judge ordered the temporary remand into custody. She didn't move at first. Then she stood too fast, her chair scraping the floor, her heel catching on the hem of her expensive coat. She stumbled forward a half step, catching herself on the table. The murmur from the gallery turned into a soft collective intake of breath. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just watched the woman who thought she could erase me stumble in front of the people she had always performed for. She kept her chin up as they led her out, but the pearls no longer looked elegant. They looked like a chain. As the judge finalized the orders, Asset Free's independent trustee referral to the district attorney's office, the courthouse doors seemed to hum with the sound of whispers from the hallway. The news would spread fast. In a town like this, nothing stayed quiet. When the hearing ended, people stood, like they do at the end of a church service, not sure whether to speak or remain reverent. Harold placed a steady hand on my shoulder and told me softly that I had just changed everything. I stepped outside into the cold air. Reporters clustered near the steps asking questions, cameras flashing like lightning against the gray sky. I didn't stop to give a statement. I didn't need to. The evidence had already spoken louder than any words I could offer. Veronica's car was still at the curb driverless. Her perfect world had cracked in a public courtroom under a single sentence from a basement speaker and the image of her own hand on a steel latch. The woman who built her power on silence had been undone by her own voice. I stood on the top step of that courthouse, looking down at the town that had always looked at us as a wealthy family behind a gate. For the first time in years, people weren't looking at me with polite detachment. They were looking with the quiet, sharp gaze reserved for truth. Somebody in the crowd shouted a question about how it felt to see her arrested. I didn't answer. I let the bruises on my wrists do the talking. I let the wind carry my silence like a stone skipping over the water. Inside, Harold was already making arrangements with the court-appointed trustee. The assets would remain frozen until the criminal case moved forward. Veronica would face kidnapping and coercion charges, and the house, my father's house, would remain under legal protection. I walked away from the courthouse steps without looking back. The pearl necklace was gone from her throat now. The image of her stumbling before the gallery stayed burned behind my eyes like the flash of a camera. If there's one moment that drew a line between before and after in my life, it was that day. The day her voice broke the courtroom. The day the town heard the truth out loud. What would you have done if you were in my place? 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, the winter light outside the detention center in York County looked as if it had been washed in iron. Veronica Kane had been placed under house arrest at first, a soft landing for a woman with polished manners and influential friends, but the moment the DA signaled intent to pursue criminal charges, she was moved to a holding facility while the pretrial motions unfolded. The letters started arriving 2 days later. At first, they came folded neatly, her cursive handwriting looping across creamy paper like a performance of grace. She wrote about love. She wrote about my father. She wrote about how we were family and how she never meant for things to get this far. Each letter ended the same way, a variation of the same desperate proposition: give her a piece of the estate, reduce the charges, call it an ugly misunderstanding between two women mourning the same man. I didn't reply. Then the calls from her lawyer began. Not formal motions, just veiled appeals. He spoke with the same measured tone he had used in the courtroom, but without the crisp edge of confidence. She wants to make amends, he said. She's ready to cooperate. If we can settle this privately, maybe you both can avoid a very public spectacle. I hung up every time. The spectacle had already happened. She had made sure of that the moment she tied me to a chair. A week later, she requested a meeting. At first, I refused. Harold advised me I was under no obligation to see her, but something in me, something colder than anger, said yes. Not because I wanted to hear her excuses, but because I wanted to look at her without flinching. For the first time, I wanted her to see what she no longer owned. The visitation room was gray and sharp-edged. No pearls, no silk, just concrete walls and the faint buzz of a failing fluorescent light overhead. She was already sitting when I walked in, hands folded around a paper cup. She wasn't wearing the mask of control anymore. Her hair had grown uneven from 3 weeks inside. The expensive blonde highlights had dulled, and her posture, once regal, had collapsed inward as though her spine had lost the strength to hold the lies up. But the eyes were the same, calculating even behind the moisture gathering at their edges. Ember, she breathed my name like it was a shared secret. Thank you for coming. I didn't sit right away. I let the silence stretch between us like a wire pulled too tight. She shifted uncomfortable, and for the first time I saw not a queen behind her gate, but a woman who finally understood that her power had a boundary. She started talking fast, like someone who feared she wouldn't be allowed to finish. I know what I did was wrong. I know that. But you have to understand, I was desperate. Your father was everything to me. Everything. When he died, I lost everything. I thought the house would keep some part of him. I thought if I kept it, I could keep him. Her voice broke at practiced places, the way someone might break a branch just enough to make it believable. You locked me in his basement, I said quietly. Her words faltered. She pushed forward anyway, hands gripping the paper cup like it might anchor her. I panicked. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted time. If you had just signed the papers, we could have figured something out. It didn't have to be this way. We could still... I interrupted. There is no we. Tears slid down her cheeks now. Whether they were real or just another layer of performance, I couldn't tell, and I didn't care. She leaned forward, voice trembling. Ember, listen to me. I loved him. Do you understand that I loved your father, and he loved me? Everything I did was because I couldn't lose what we built. You have everything now. The house, the company, the name. I have nothing. I let her words hang in the air. They didn't touch me. She wasn't wrong that my father had loved her in his way, but love isn't a rope. It isn't a basement. It isn't a command whispered through a speaker. She finally dropped the last of her pride. Her voice cracked for real this time. Please, just give me a piece of it. The house, the trust, anything. If I can show cooperation, they'll reduce the sentence. I can serve probation. I can disappear. You'll never have to see me again. Please. The guard standing by the door looked away like someone trying to avoid overhearing something indecent. Her lawyer, seated off to the side, cleared his throat softly, signaling her to calm down, but she didn't. Her manicured hands, less polished now, nails chipped, reached toward the edge of the table as though grasping for the life she once held so easily. I sat down then. Slowly. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, so that she had to look me directly in the eyes. You think this is about money? I said softly. You think if you get a piece of it, you get to rewrite what happened. But you don't. You can't. Her lips trembled. Ember, I made a mistake. No, I said. You made a decision. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the low buzz of the fluorescent light. I let that silence press against her chest the way her voice had once pressed against mine in that basement. I wanted her to feel it. She tried again. I can fix this. You locked me in my father's basement, I said. My voice was steady now, cold as the winter outside. That's the only share you get. Her face crumpled. She wasn't the composed, calculating woman who had stalked through the house like a storm anymore. She was just a cornered animal, realizing the cage she'd built had turned on her. She sobbed not elegant tears, but the ugly kind that scrape out of a person who finally understands no one is listening. I stood up. Her lawyer made a weak attempt to stop me with a Miss Quinn. Perhaps we could, but I didn't break stride. She reached across the table, then fingers clawing the air like she could grab me back into her world. Ember, she shouted. You can't just walk away. But I could, and I did. I walked to the door and gave the guard a small nod. He opened it without a word. Behind me, her sobs filled the space like wind in a broken house. I didn't turn around. Not once. Not even when she called my name again, softer this time. I stepped into the hallway and the door closed behind me with the heavy sound of a lock falling into place. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, untouched by her voice. I breathed it in slowly, the way you breathe after surfacing from cold water. The sky above the detention center was the same dull gray as the day of the hearing, but it no longer felt heavy. Harold met me by the car. Did she say what we expected, he asked. Yes, I said. Exactly what we expected. He nodded once the way a man nods when a long line of events settles into its rightful order. Then we move forward. As we drove away, I looked out the window and saw the gates of the detention center grow smaller in the mirror until they vanished completely. That was where she belonged now, not in the house my father built, not in the world she had tried to control. The basement she'd chosen for me had become the trap she walked into herself. There was no satisfaction in that thought, just a clean, quiet finality. The verdict came down on a clear December morning, the kind of morning where the ocean air felt sharp enough to cut glass. I stood outside the courthouse in York County, watching my breath curl into the cold as the bailiff's voice echoed down the hallway. 12 years. That was the sentence. 12 years for kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and attempted coercion of a legal heir. When the judge read those words, the sound didn't feel triumphant. It felt final, like the slamming of an old iron gate. Veronica sat at the defense table in her plain correctional jumpsuit, looking nothing like the woman who once wore silk robes and pearls while telling me to sign away my inheritance. Her posture was still straight, but the arrogance that used to cling to her like expensive perfume was gone. When the judge finished, she stared at the wooden table as if searching for a reflection of the life she had lost. But there was nothing left there for her to see. The house the company shares the full $20 million, all of it remained exactly where my father intended, the diocese of his estate held. Harold Price closed the legal file like a man sealing a chapter of history, and I breathed for what felt like the first time in months. No more hearings. No more cold basement air in my lungs when I closed my eyes. It was over. In the weeks that followed, the media swarmed the story. Kennebunkport Gazette ran its headline in thick, unapologetic letters. Stepdaughter outsmarts stepmom's 20-dealer plot. Larger regional outlets picked it up next, spinning my basement escape into a parable about greed and resilience. A few tried to make it glamorous, some twisted it into a morality play. I ignored most of it. The noise belonged to the outside world. My victory, if that's what they wanted to call it, didn't need to live on front pages. It lived in every breath I took, without fear. I returned to the house 1 week after the sentencing. The air smelled the same as it had the day I was taken, but it didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like something waiting to be reclaimed. I walked down the basement stairs deliberately, step by step, my fingers trailing along the cold stone wall. The camera was gone now, the ropes long removed, but the shape of the place remained. The corner where the chair had been, the echo of dripping water, the hatch that saved me. It would have been easy to seal that basement forever, to board it up and pretend those 5 days never happened. But that's not what my father built this house for. He built it to hold stories, his mine and the ones that would come after. So I turned that basement into something else, into light, into defiance, into memory. Contractors came in to clean the space top to bottom. We stripped away the mold, scrubbed the stone, and sanded down the old beams until they shone pale against the new lighting. Where the ropes had been, I installed glass display cases with photographs of my father's life blueprints of the house, the original property deed, the first letterhead of his company. The hatch I'd used to escape wasn't patched over. I left it open, framed with soft white lights and a simple plaque above it, "The Way Out." On the far wall, I mounted a single bronze plaque with my father's words etched into it. "No one can own a house built on someone else's pain." I had found that line in his old journal a few weeks after the trial ended. It felt right here where pain had tried to build its kingdom. Local artists helped me open the basement as a small gallery, a memorial not just to my father, but to every woman who had ever been told to stay quiet while someone else wrote her story for her. On opening day, people came from across town. Some had never spoken to me before. They stood in front of the plaque, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet nods as if they understood more than words could say. Letters started arriving from places I had never been. People who had lived through inheritance battles, coercion, manipulative step-parents, siblings who had stolen spouses who had erased them from wills. They wrote about being gaslit into silence, about watching homes slip through their fingers, about how no one believed them because money has a way of turning cruelty into something invisible. I read every letter. I answered as many as I could. Some of those letters came from women who had never even seen Maine. One woman from Ohio wrote about her brother holding her inheritance hostage after their father died. Another from California described a stepfather who forged signatures. A man from Illinois wrote simply, "Your story gave me the courage to call my lawyer." Each envelope was a small weight in my hands, a reminder that what happened to me wasn't unique. It was just louder this time because it happened in a house with a big number attached to it. Veronica was gone now, swallowed into a system she used to think she could outsmart. I didn't follow her sentencing coverage beyond the official documents. She wrote me one last letter from prison, the handwriting shaky, a pale ghost of the letters she used to send when she thought she still had power. I never opened it. I burned it in the fireplace my father built when I was 6. The flames took the envelope easily, curling it black until it was nothing but ash. Harold came by the house that same night, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a manila envelope with the final closing documents for the estate. The trust was now fully under my control. "Your father would have been proud," he said simply. I believed him. The gallery became more than I expected. People began to visit not just to see the house, but to talk. Some left notes folded under the plaque. Some sat on the benches and cried quietly before walking out. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about the story of a woman who was locked in the dark and found her way to the light, and about all the people who needed to know they weren't alone in their battles. One night, I stood alone in the basement, the gallery empty except for the soft hum of the new lighting. I ran my hand over the plaque above the hatch, remembering the sound of my heartbeat the night I slipped through it. The fear then had been thick and metallic, but what I felt now was something else entirely. Power. Not loud power. Not the kind Veronica had tried to wield. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. Upstairs, the house was warm again. I had replaced the old drapes with linen ones that caught the morning sun. I painted the upstairs hallway the pale blue my father loved. In the living room, I kept his rocking chair facing the ocean. I sat there sometimes, coffee in hand, watching the horizon where sky and water kissed, and I thought of everything that had happened in the span of one autumn and one winter. Justice hadn't erased what she did, but it made space for me to live again without the weight of her voice sitting on my chest. The house no longer felt like her territory. It felt like mine. Not because of the deed or the money, but because I had reclaimed it from the dark. The papers eventually stopped calling. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, new names. But the people who needed to know still found their way to the basement with its white lights and the words on the wall. I didn't need to speak for them. I just needed to keep the door open. When I look back now, it's not her face I remember most. It's the sound of my own breath as I climbed out of that crawl space. It's the way the air hit me like a blade and a promise all at once. It's the way a house can be both a prison and a home, depending on who holds the keys. Veronica thought the basement would end me. Instead, it became the place I rebuilt myself. Spring came early to Kennebunkport in 2026, the kind of soft, hesitant spring where the air still carries the memory of winter, but the light finally feels warm enough to let your shoulders relax. I woke up on the first morning of April to the sound of gulls slicing across the horizon and the smell of salt drifting in through the open window. For a long time after everything happened, I had thought the house would always carry the scent of fear in its walls. But now it smelled of paint sea breeze and the faint trace of tulips from the garden just outside the porch. I padded down the stairs barefoot passing the gallery door as the early light flooded through the new glass panels we had installed where the basement door used to be a dull slab of oak. The basement was no longer a place I descended into. It was part of the house now, part of the light. The white walls gleamed softly, and the wide glass doors at the far end opened out toward the rocky coast. You could hear the ocean breathing from down here. The floor was smooth concrete, polished and warm under the light streaming in. Along the left wall hung pieces from local artists and survivors, ceramics, paintings, photographs. Above the hatch that had once been my escape, the words "The Way Out" gleamed on a bronze plaque. Students would touch it like a talisman when they entered. I had opened the small interior design studio just 2 months earlier, tucked into the east wing of the house that my father once used as a study. What began as sketches on napkins and quiet plans during long nights became a working space with clean lines, reclaimed wood tables, and shelves full of material swatches. The studio wasn't meant to build an empire. It was meant to build a future. Mine. Every week, women from around town came to the house. Some were quiet, some loud. Some carried stories they weren't ready to say out loud yet. Some didn't need to speak at all. I offered free evening classes on basic interior design and renovation. Small things at first, how to repair a wall, how to make a room your own. It wasn't about the walls or the furniture. It was about the act of taking back a space. They came with notebooks with eyes that had seen too much, and little by little they left with the beginnings of something new. I remembered how powerless I had felt in that basement, how small the world had become when the only thing between me and the dark was a knot of rope. And then I remembered what it felt like to push against that knot until it loosened. So I taught them how to hold a hammer, how to measure the span of their own strength. I watched their shoulders straighten week by week. Some of them brought their daughters. Some came alone. All of them carried the same quiet storm I once had. The press had faded away long ago, which was exactly how I liked it. The house was no longer a headline. It was a sanctuary. Tourists sometimes wandered past, whispering about the story, but they didn't linger. The ones who stayed were the ones who understood why a house can hold both pain and healing without contradiction. Every afternoon around 4, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and walked out to the porch that faced the sea. My father's old rocking chair sat where it always had, creaking softly in the wind. The ocean stretched out in front of me like a living thing, gray-blue and endless. The house behind me hummed with quiet life. The students packing up their sketch pads, the gallery lights dimming automatically, the wood warming under the sun. I sat in the chair with the tea cupped between my palms and listened to the rhythm of the waves. For a long time after she locked me down there, I couldn't sit still without feeling like something was going to close in on me. Silence felt dangerous. But now, it wrapped around me like an old friend. Sometimes when I was alone, I traced the scars around my wrists with the tips of my fingers. They weren't angry red anymore. They had faded into soft lines pale against my skin. They didn't make me flinch when I touched them. They just reminded me where I'd been, what I'd survived. I thought of my father often during those quiet hours. Not the way he was at the end, tired and trusting the wrong person, but the way he was when he built this house. Sweaty and laughing with dirt under his fingernails. He built it for love. She tried to turn it into a weapon, but in the end, I got to decide what it became. Harold visited sometimes, usually on Fridays. He'd bring me coffee and updates on the foundation he helped me set up with part of the estate, a small legal fund to assist people fighting coercion in inheritance disputes. We didn't make speeches or hang banners. We just quietly paid legal fees for people who thought they didn't have a way out. I liked it that way. Quiet work. Real work. The letters still came, though less often now. People who'd heard the story, who had lived their own. They didn't write to praise me. They wrote to say thank you for making them feel less invisible. I kept every letter in a wooden box my father carved for me when I was 12. On nights when the wind howled against the eaves, I would take out a few and read them with the sound of the sea behind me. Spring grew warmer. The tulips turned into roses. I painted the kitchen walls pale green. The gallery filled with more art. The students started to bring their own pieces to hang. The house was changing again like it always had, but this time it was becoming mine on my terms. I never went to see Veronica in prison. I didn't need to. She existed now in a place where the walls belonged to someone else. She no longer cast a shadow here. Some people asked me if forgiving her would bring me peace, but peace isn't something you give to the person who tried to take everything from you. It's something you build in the quiet after they're gone. One evening after the last class ended and the house grew quiet, I stepped into the basement gallery alone. The lights were low, washing the walls in soft gold. The plaque above the hatch caught the light. The way out. I ran my hand along it slowly. Then I looked at the art the women had hung that week, bright, chaotic bursts of color and lines that didn't try to be neat. It felt alive in a way the house hadn't felt in years. I walked back upstairs and out onto the porch, settling into the rocking chair. The ocean was calm that night, the sky streaked with soft pink. My tea was warm in my hands. The house behind me was alive, not with fear or control, but with laughter, movement, and quiet strength. I tilted my head back and let the breeze carry the salt across my face. This house was once my cage, I whispered to the wind. Now it's my home. I didn't need applause. I didn't need headlines. All I needed was this, the sound of the sea, the weight of the chair beneath me, and the certainty that I had turned darkness into something that could hold light. I had reclaimed my life, not in a single moment of triumph, but in 1,000 quiet choices, one day at a time. And that was enough. I sat on the porch with the ocean at my back and the camera in front of me, its small red light blinking steadily in the fading spring light. For a moment, I just let the silence breathe. The house behind me glowed with warm light from the windows, soft and golden, nothing like the shadows it once held. My hands were steady as I set the mug of tea down and looked straight into the lens. I didn't have to rehearse this part. It had lived inside me for months. What would you have done if your stepmom locked you in a basement for $20 million? My voice was calm, clear, the kind of tone that sinks into the chest instead of rising into the air. Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear them. The porch creaked softly under my chair as the wind picked up from the shore, carrying the sound of waves breaking against the rocks. I let the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer, not to dramatize, but to let it land. Then I leaned forward slightly, eyes steady on the lens. Never underestimate a quiet woman with proof. This story was mine, but it wasn't just mine anymore. I knew the faces behind the letters. I'd seen the way people's shoulders straightened when they realized they weren't alone in what they'd been through. I wanted them to feel this moment the way I did now, steady, grounded, free. I lifted the mug again and smiled, not the polite kind, but the quiet one that comes from surviving something meant to break you. Share your story, I said softly. Tap like if you believe justice matters. And subscribe for more true revenge stories. The wind pushed against the microphone, a soft whisper, like the sea agreeing with me. I didn't need loud music. I didn't need flashing words. I just needed this, a house reclaimed, a story told, a truth that couldn't be buried in the dark again. I let the camera record a few seconds longer, capturing nothing but the sound of the ocean and the fading light around me, then reached out and turned it off.